Okay, so we're live. Alex, go ahead and take it away.
Yes. And also just one thing, Greg, when I'm showing Miriam's presentation, I will probably not be able to see anything else.
I
So
will monitor it,
just for the presentation, I mean, I will be focused on it. So just,
of
yeah, thank you for,
course.
yeah, giving a look at the other things.
Of course.
Very well. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to you all connected from all over the world, actually, for this new session of our seminar series being singular. I'm Alessandro De Cesaris. I'm now in Fribourg at the University of Freiburg in Switzerland, and I'm the co-organizer of this event series together with Gregory Scott Moss from the Chinese University of Hong Kong. This is the second year that we've been organizing this seminar cycle, and I must say I'm very excited about it because it's a topic I'm very fond of, and we've been having so many exciting discussions about this. And today we are going. We are having a new, very welcome guest with us. We have Mirjam Schaub, which I'm going to present in just a few seconds for a new talk that maybe gives another contribution. We had many talks that, so to say, come from an Hegelian or one could say maybe hyper-rationalist perspective. We've had some contributions that come from analytic philosophy, and we've been having last year a couple of contributions about Gilles Deleuze and French contemporary thought, which is of course a huge tradition and a very important tradition in order to discuss about singularity. So one of the challenges of this seminar series is to put in contact traditions that don't always, not always very much talk to each other, so to say. So I'm very excited, and I'm sure Gregory is too, to present today's speaker, Mirjam Schaub, who's professor at the University of Applied Sciences, we could say maybe in English, in Hamburg, and who's actually an expert on the topic. She has written a beautiful book on the singular and the oh, sorry. On the singular and the exemplary, I will just quote it. Is the German title is Das Singuläre und das Exemplarische zur Logik und Praxis der Beispiele in Philosophie und Ästhetik. Then she's an expert of the philosophy on Gilles Deleuze. She's written, in particular, there are two books. One is called, a beautiful title, Gilles Deleuze im Wunderland, Zeit als Ereignisphilosophie. And another, Gilles Deleuze im Kino, das Sichtbare und das Sagbare. But she's also worked in television, in the field of contemporary art, in cinema. She has done a lot, and that's also one reason why we are very, very honored to have her with us today for a talk that's called Singularity as the Scandal and Exemplarity as the Remedy of Aesthetic Theories with Regard to Philosophy. So, Mirjam, I will thank you now for your participation, and thank you so much for having accepted to be here with us today. What will happen is the usual. That means we have around 45 to 60 minutes, but I mean, it's very loose, so no problem for your presentation. Afterwards, we will have a discussion. And of course, the discussion will be possible with you here on Zoom or with those who are following us on YouTube. If you have questions on YouTube, you can just write them, and I or Greg will read them for you. I will now share my screen with the presentation. I believe it should work now. And so if everyone can see my presentation, Mirjam, you have the floor. Again, thank you for being here.
Yeah, many thanks for inviting me. As Alessandro, we met last year for the first time in Fribourg on the Conference for Aesthetics. And I'm very pleased to talk about my book on exemplarity and singularity, which appeared, I have to say, 14 years ago. It was my habilitation. And it was not much discussed at the time. And I'm very pleased that in the past 5 years, I was lots and more invited to talk about that topic. So I do it from a continental philosophy background, and I'll do it, but especially today, I'll talk also about Nelson Goodman and Georgia Agamben. And these are all excerpts out of my research that I conducted a decade ago. And I'm a little bit nervous about discussing it now, but also very excited in getting to know your response in this wider context of singularity, a concept that has sprung back into discussion after Andreas Reckwitz, a sociologist, published a book on singularity as the new mode of our contemporary existence. So, dear Alessandro, if you be so kind to show the next slide, you'll see the content of my talk. And I think you have to click a second time. I think it is, yeah. So first, I'll start with a brief introduction. Why are examples a very good issue here in order to distinguish these two notions of singularity and exemplarity? Because I will try to show how interrelated these two concepts are. So first of all, the work of the philosopher is primarily understood working on the argument or on creating a concept. Examples, on the other hand, play a very secondary role as they merely serve illustrative purposes. Some examples, such as the paddling, breaking in the water to explain, for instance, the nature of an optical illusion, are as old as philosophy itself. And other examples, such as the famous "the cat is on the mat," serves to amuse the audience. Austin remarked that oversimplification, schematization, and constant obsessive repetition of the same worn-out examples were too notorious to, quote, to be dismissed as an occasional weakness of philosophers. Examples, not only the successful ones, but also those that fail, therefore carry weight. Which weight? What would happen if we simply blacked out all examples, both the simple-minded and the sophisticated, in philosophical texts? Well, I guess you will all agree concepts would lose their context, arguments would begin to jump around, and theories would become untenable because they would be meaningless. The given example itself may be interchangeable, but the place where it stands is not. The example itself is an ambiguous thing. In theory, it must be found in practice. But in practice, it is often chosen, discarded, it is sharpened, or in another way, shaped by philosophers. It is supposed to be special in order to be an all-around example through itself. So it has to be singular and exemplary at the same time. It says one thing, but it is supposed to show something else. The example moves astonishingly freely between the poles of the interchangeability of a Latin exemplum and the irreplaceability of a Greek paradigma. So even though who speak German, you will see that the Beispiel also has like a third tradition that means something that is out of joint, something that is not exactly in the joint, that is beiherspielend in German. So we have this Latin word exemplum that comes from eximere, and it is really a language from the forestry. It means really to take out a tree out of the woods. That is where it comes from. And the Greek paradigma, on the other hand, so the exemplum comes from the exemplary thing, something that can be exchanged, and the paradigma in Greek says the opposite. It says something that cannot be replaced by something else. So in disciplinary terms, examples are very as you see, are border crossing. As application of a rule, they belong to the logic. And as concretizations of something abstract, they fall into the realm of rhetoric. And as proving stones or as carriages, as in Kant, of judgment, they are important means of philosophical propedeutics. So their materiality, one can say, counts for their weight, while their referentiality remains vague. Examples are not merely representative and inauthentic, like arbitrary signs for something else, but they are prototypically and materially for something of which they themselves promise to be a part, separated only for demonstrative purposes. At the same time, we are supposed to read through them in a particular way in order to better grasp the intended intellectual argumentative structure behind. So it means a theory derives its credibility and its relevance to a considerable extent from the fact that there is a demonstrable case at all, that there is something outside the theory, not generated by the theory, that is prepared to illustrate something that is built up in a theory. Examples are thus part of the critical negotiation mass of a philosophical theory, and they are consequently a source of constant dispute. Possible cases find their way into philosophical argumentation as brief examples or as counterexamples. They become part of a selective narrative that obeys its own imaginative laws. Rarely do philosophers master, this is my general thesis in that book Alessandro was quoting, rarely the philosophers master the involuntary transfer effects that radiate from the chosen example back to the theory. So this is what we call in German the Eigenleben of the example, that they, if you look closely to the example, they do not show what they shall show. Instead, they show something else. And this sometimes is the opposite of what they are meant for. So I come now to the second, that was the introduction, very in general, to give you an idea from which angle I look into examples and why the examples have to do something with the exemplum and the paradigma, and why this is not easily to be reconciled. Dear Alessandro, could you now go to the second? I think you have to click twice because that was the first, you can skip that. And now we come to the second chapter, examples no, go back. Yeah, that's fine. Examples as an implicit object of aesthetics. So now I come closer to the title of my talk. So the reason giving for the exemptions from the traditional categorization into theoretical or practical philosophy are its entanglement with human sensuality. So the examples are flirting with the subjective, the useless and the accidental, or its proximity to psychology. Aesthetics can be brought into contact with ethical, religious, social, and political issues. And its disciplinary openness makes it possible for empiricists, for rationalists, and for metaphysicians, and phenomenologists, and hermeneutists, and language, and analysts, and deontologists, and post-structuralists, and women to talk profitably about aesthetics. So despite its connectivity, the attitude of academic philosophy towards aesthetic remains a little bit reserved. This defensive attitude is all the more surprising given that it itself maintains a relation to its own theorizing and conceptual creation that can certainly be described as aesthetic. Anyone who pursues philosophy will find ideas, speculations, and theories interesting as such, and they will also make them the subject of their reflection for the sake of the stringency or the boldness, their beauty or their obscurity, and the ambivalence of philosophy towards aesthetics, and at the same time, the tendency to aestheticize one's own theories and concepts needs to be clarified in more detail. The role of aesthetics within philosophy is marginal and fundamental at the same time. Since antiquity, it has appeared as a competitor to philosophy, and yet it has always been marginalized due to its sensuality. At the same time, since the Enlightenment, it has been seen as an effective philosophy of absence from the realm of necessity and purpose. It has seen often as a modern substitute to religion. And also this enigmatic character of the works of arts is here to be reminded of. So if aesthetics is taken seriously at all, it immediately runs the risk of being taken too seriously. It is then often described the character of a model for cognition, a model for perception or experience in general. And my question is, where does this tendency towards exemplarity and simultaneous marginalization of the aesthetics come from? And what weakness of philosophy and what strength of aesthetics does it reveal itself? My assumption is that the precarious position of aesthetics within philosophy has less to do with sensuality as such than with one of the qualities associated with sensuality, namely the problem of singularity, with the experience of uniqueness, in particular with the precarious, or in some philosophical schools, completely denied capacity for truth of individual things or individual events. And now there comes the first quote, dear Alessandro. It is from William James. Greek philosophers soon formed the notion that a knowledge of so-called universals, consisting of concepts of abstract forms, qualities, numbers, and relations, was the only knowledge worthy of the truly philosophic mind. Particular facts decay, and our perceptions of them vary. A concept never varies, and between such unvarying terms, the relation must be constant and express eternal verities. Hence, there arises a tendency which has lasted all through philosophy to contrast the knowledge of universals and intellectuals as godlike, dignified, and honorable to the knower, with that of particulars and sensibles as something relatively base, with more allies as with the beasts, sorry. And now John Dewey supplements this philosophical critical diagnosis as follows, and that is the second quote. Greek thinkers saw clearly and logically that experience cannot furnish us, as respects cognition of existence, with anything more than contingent probability. In the older theory, sense and experience were barriers to true science because they are implicated in natural change. This material in the older notion is inherently so particular, so contingent and variable, that by no means can it contribute to knowledge. Knowledge in its full and valid sense is possible only of the immutable, the fixed. That alone answers the quest for certainty. So from its very beginnings, philosophy has therefore been focused on truths that are fully proven by reason and as such can claim universal validity. And as a discipline, it legitimizes itself through the successful penetration of a generality postulated by it, achieved through abstraction and made to shine through categorical separation, which was apparently allowed to claim validity and binding force for everyone, with the unique and the one-off, unrepeatable, as well as the perception and the experience accompanying it as a merely particular, individual, accidental, and coincidental, contingent, so without necessary existence. All this appear to be downright appear to be downright superfluous. Just like the concept of God, truth, and philosophy, regardless of whether it was understood as adequatio rei, ad cogitationis, or post-Cartesian as rightness, it remained closely linked to the idea of a practical universability. The imminent upheaval of this view can be traced in the transcript of Hegel's lectures on aesthetics. And that is now the third quote. I hope I have it. I'm not quite sure.
Yes. I'm sorry, but there is some lagging, so it takes a few seconds to
Okay, that's
join.
fine. That's fine. As is well known, Plato began to demand of philosophical contemplation in a deeper way that objects should not be recognized in their particularity, but in their generality, in their genus, in their being in itself, by asserting that the true is not the individual good action, true opinions, beautiful people, or work of arts, but the good, the beautiful, the true itself. And by this contemplation of the beautiful in its own idea, can itself again an abstract metaphysics, and even if Plato is taken as the basis and guide, the Platonic abstractions can no longer suffice for us, even for the logical idea of the beautiful. We must grasp it more deeply and more concretely ourselves. By the lack of content that clings to the Platonic idea no longer satisfies the richer philosophical needs of our modern mind. So, the disciplinary independence of aesthetics within philosophy, with its academic beginnings with Baumgarten's Latin-written Aesthetica writings of 1750 and 58, aesthetics is closely linked to the discovery of what I call an impure truth, the truth of the sensually mediated single thing. And so Baumgarten himself relates aesthetics, regardless of whether it's understood as the theory of the liberal arts or as an art of beautiful thinking. It is simply a scientia cognitio sensitiva. It is a science of sensory knowledge, and the goal and the end is nothing less than the active, as he says, perfection of sensory knowledge as such. And here I come why this kind of singularity is a scandalon of philosophy, but still becomes very much important as a characteristics of aesthetics through the shift from singularity to the concept of exemplarity. So I would even say that the moment this kind of singularity in aesthetics becomes obvious, there starts a discursive mechanism that protects and shields this scandalous notion of singularity and brings it back to something what is easier to handle with. And this is what we then see as exemplary thinking. So in order to, in a way, to cover up the scandal, another notion, the notion of exemplarity, rises and becomes more and more important in the discourse. It should have become clear that my concern with examples in philosophy is not simply a philological interest. Since Baumgarten, the question of examples has been closely linked to a decisive moment and use of, I can say, the aesthetic foundation of theory. In a formulation by Roland Barthes, it is about the old dream of the absolutely particular, le particulier absolu, in which uniqueness becomes synonymous with randomness and adventure, when I quote, the unrestricted, the blind, and where it is the uninformed contingency La contingence souveraine mate combat meets the real, le réel, in its inexhaustible expression, son expression infatigable. Taking the photographs of Nadar or Alfred Stieglitz or André Kertész as examples, Barthes speaks of la science impossible de l'être unique. He speaks of a matesis singularis, of those individua or singularita whose existence, since William Ockham, guarantees only to be incomplete and shadowy. Since Baumgarten, the scandal of aesthetics has consisted in elevating a single thing, essential, finite, concrete something, to the rank of a cognition that does not simply exist via the lower cognitive faculties. The idea of truth and generality, veritas generalis, can only be revealed beyond the sensual world of visibility, that is, a classical topos in philosophy. And now there is suddenly this beauty of sensory cognition, just like the fineness, Baumgarten says, elegancia of these objects suddenly expresses a successful composition in itself, which because of its non-simple perfection can be called universalis for Baumgarten. And as Hans-Georg Gadamer states, such a cognitio sensitive or essential cognition is a paradox in the great tradition of cognition that we have cultivated since the Greeks. Because, as Gadamer says, cognition is something only ever when it has left behind the subjective sensual conditionality and reason grasps the general and the lawful in these things. Using the example of the sunset, which is of course a romantic topos, Gadamer says it enchanted us, and he makes clear that it is precisely not in its pars pro toto character that it is relevant to us. So when talking about the sunset, Gadamer says its truth, which the sunset has for us, it does not consist in a general lawfulness that is represented in it. Rather, cognitio sensitiva means that even in that which is apparently only the particular of sensory experience, and which we always tend to relate to in general, sometimes suddenly holds us in the face of beauty and compels us to dwell on what appears individually. What concerns us in it? What is it that is recognized in it? What is important and significant about this isolation that it can claim to be truth, and that not only the general, like the mathematically formulated laws of nature, are true? To find an answer to this question is the task of philosophical aesthetics. So the project of aesthetics is thus, we can say, a heretical one from the outset, because it undermines the truth claim of the abstract, the general, which its insistence on the truth of a single thing or a single event, a veritas singularis. And no other than Jean-Jacques Rousseau, he takes up Baumgarten's impulse for such a veritas singularis in a unique and in a revolutionary and rebellious way in the first book of his Confessions, when he writes programmatically. I skip it in French. And he says, Rousseau plans his books with the most difficult confession, an enterprise which has no model and whose execution will never find an imitator. To be without model and at the same time without setting an example oneself, and therefore to be unique, not to be copied, not to be imitated, That is what constitutes, in Rousseau's words, the scandal of veritable veritas singularis. I want to show before my peers a man in all the truths of nature. But how? How can uncorrupted and maybe absolutely truthful human being be shown who at the same time fits into the exemplary, modelless events of Rousseau's own project? Well, quite simply, he says, cet homme, ce sera moi, and this man will be me, and that is a great move. That would indeed be unthinkable in the familiar exemplary Baroque order of knowledge, one for all, a completely ordinary man who sets out to set a new type of example in his own name, the non-represented, the non-exemplary role model against his will and against his better judgment. And then he states, I start this book with me alone. I sense my heart and I know the man. I am not like any of those I've seen, and I will not be like any of those who exist. And if I do not live better, at least I'm different. And then he ends up with this formulation: whether nature has done well or ill in breaking the mold in which she fashioned me can only be judged after reading me. So this allusion to the long broken clay mold summarizes Rousseau's claim. No second Rousseau, no copy can be produced from such a form. Its product is singular and irretrievably cut off from its origin. The born man can never return to his mother's womb. And this duality characterizes then also the following of Rousseau's argument. He claims no authority above his own. There was no one who was like him, but also no one who could take his failure away from him. And at the same time, there should be no one who could emulate his example. Why this double reassurance, we may ask? Not following an example and not setting an example, doesn't that also mean not wanting to follow an example and not wanting to set an example? Is it a matter of inner necessity or is it a free decision? Could it be an inclusive at the same time? And then he follows the example, be it ordinary, be it disastrous, or both at the same time, plays an excellent role from the very first pages of the famous Confessions of Rousseau. It is instructive precisely to the extent that it itself can you say that? Singularizes knowledge in that it polarizes, it evaluates, and it takes sides. An example from which everybody learns something different, also something exclusive, organizes a new type of knowledge. I may call that a confessional knowledge. Am I talking too slow or too fast?
It's perfectly clear to me, but
It's fine. It's good.
Okay, good.
The pace.
So I come to the chapter about exemplarity as quasi-generality. So Hegel did not forget to mock in his inaugural lectures 68 years later, so after Rousseau, that only the untrue, the temporal, and the transient enjoyed in Germany as it were the privilege of being recognized. The inauguration of aesthetics as a philosophical subdiscipline, which also enjoyed great popularity among the public, remains tainted from the outset with this suspicion that the individual thing may prove unworthy of the new aesthetic appreciation. And I think this is also why in Kant's Aesthetic of Taste, it allows it only to appear as a trigger of aesthetic pleasure in his critique of judgment. For Kant, aesthetic judgment can logically only be called exemplary. That is a necessity of the agreement to all to a judgment, which is regarded as the example of a general rule that cannot be stated. As a product of genius, a work of art is therefore for Kant an example not of imitation, but of succession to another genius, as he says. And as a counterweight, we must, at this point, we can see there is a new strategy that turns itself from Baumgarten, as it did for Kant, which also is the advantage of transforming the obvious philosophical weakness of aesthetics into a strength. If the concrete individual cannot be eternal, imperishable, universal, and capable in truth in its classic sense, then it must at least become exemplary. In this concrete example that it is prepared to give and is capable of pointing beyond the limitations and the finiteness of its own existence. So the exemplarity then appears as can we say, a complementary concept that can be used to replace the concept of singularity, which was just beginning to emerge. So the concept of exemplarity in return articulates itself in a non-aesthetic context in the first appropriation of the individual and his free will, and henceforth dominates the political philosophy of the Enlightenment era. Since then, individuality and individualization have been parts of the defining trait. Indeed, the routine self-understanding of the Western intellectual world. It is therefore not surprising that Giorgio Agamben has a very easy time when he sees the coming community dawning again in an extremely particular form of arbitrariness, freely adapted from the Andy Warhol motto and book title From A to B and Back Again, because, I quote, a singularity that is exhibited as such is arbitrary, quod libet, which means it is lovable. And I'm not that year. Yeah. However, as I'm waxed, yeah, that's Kant. It is by no means easy to dissimulate the ordinary from the extraordinary, just as it is not easy to dissimulate the determining from the reflecting judgment. Something is at the same time the case of a given law, and in order for hitherto unclassified singular cases become the principle of a law, it is necessary for it to attain a certain exemplarity. This is sorry. I took the wrong. It's the right quote, but it's of course it is Mauricio Ferrari, and it's not Kant here because he talks about Kant, as we see in the second part. This is the eventuality that Kant asserts in relation to works of art, the singular case that places itself at the beginning of a canon. If we now try to recognize what holds all these achievements together, being an arbitrary case, a principle of recognition, placing oneself at the beginning of a law, we find ourselves before an essentially teleological dimension. The example places itself at the service of imitation, that specific form of imitation that consists in application. The present, that which is present, prepares itself for a use yet to come, for a purpose that has not yet been fulfilled. In order to answer the question of how it was possible around 1750 to design uniqueness, for Hegel, 70 later, it was merely the bland counterpart to the equally bland abstract generality, as a philosophically interesting phenomenon, how the unavailability, the uniqueness, and the unrepeatability of aesthetics experience can be made connectable. And it appears as a substitute epistemic distinction, as the greatest possible approximation, one can say, as an alternative form of play, or even as a secondary form of generality, as a temporary timelessness appropriate to the unique and unrepeatable and possible. So unrepeatability becomes the decisive quality feature and the reason for the appreciation of the individual, just as transcendence and fleetiness soon become the insignia of aesthetic experience. So the fact that this immediately give rise to a series of problems, especially for aesthetics, it is so readily taken into service as the pioneer and excellent discipline within philosophy that can only be touched here. So I'm saying here in general that we need this counterbalance of the exemplary to proceed with the idea of unrepeatability. So the exemplary, in a way, agrees to the unrepeatability, but sees it being repeated in other examples. So maybe we can understand this more clearly if we go to Susan Nyman, who expresses the unbridgeable difference between the singular and the exemplary in the foreword to the German edition of a History of Idea treatise called Evil in Modern Thought. Maybe you know that piece. So now comes the Nyman quote. The question of how it was possible for the same people to produce Kant, Bach, and the gas chambers was of little concern to me. The unusual decision at the time to come to Germany as a Jew, and without German roots at that, was a personal response to this. So she's referring to her own history of coming to Germany. The horror that emanated from German soil was exemplary, but not unique. And after all, the country I came from also had a lot to answer for, albeit not as visible and clearly, but the remorse was also not as visible and clear. She's talking about the United States of America. Quite apart from whether Nyman's sentence is true and whether a Holocaust survivor would say so, can this sentence be turned around? Can one say unique but not exemplary? I'd say hardly. In other words, by implication, and in Nyman's version, the unique is deficient, whereas the exemplary is always rich and overflowing. But isn't there also an important argument hidden in this, namely that exemplarity makes the unique disappear in the first place? Or must we insist, as Jean-François Lyotard does in his debate with Derrida, Goliath, Kaufmann et Lacoue-Labarthe and others in Sprechen nach Auschwitz, that the horror, meaning the organized murders of Jews and the genocide of the Nazis, was unique and therefore cannot be exemplary. By Auschwitz, we mean, according to Lyotard, something that breaks the speculative chain of our sentences, of our talking. But every sentence that is understood as a case, even the one just uttered, can in turn be a model, even for the nameless, of the incommensurable of the horror of industrial mass murder as it happened in the Third Reich in Germany. Lyotard therefore opposes Adorno's attempt to take Auschwitz as an affirmative model for and in negative dialectics. Only in the face of the exemplary does the attempt to give meaning, even negative meaning, fail. But precisely because there is no rule of connection vis-à-vis the singular, we seek it. It is necessary to take the risk of linking across the abyss of the inhuman, even at the risk of misunderstanding and ignorance and forgetting. It must be linked, as Lyotard says, it must be understood in this way. And it is almost, or it becomes almost an ethical demand. Everything else would be a crime, according to Lyotard. To link, and that means to create meaning without in turn making a rule out of it, is an attempt that we have to undertake to give the singular a place in discord without dissolving or defuting it as a scandal, but at the same time not to sacralize it through silence. And according to Lyotard, it is impossible to prevent a new, better model for connections and the creation of meaning from emerging from this linking of the unconnectable against our better judgment. Linking would then mean recognizing that this always results in separation, and conjunction means nothing more that two similar and yet differently strong variables under the same joke get there for a brief moment. And in this sense, the singular and the exemplary, which give these considerations their title, remain antipodes. This is particularly evident in the science to the singular from its apolitic side. And I come now to the chapter about the objects of aesthetics and the involuntarily exemplary character. How do things, objects such as work of art or events characterized by their intensity and quality become the object of philosophical debates in the first place? For according to this observation, despite the ubiquity of their utilization and the exemplarity of their modes of action, the counterpart of aesthetic theory remains strangely unexplained. Not all problems can be solved by pursuing the philosophy of art instead of aesthetics. Why should the more concept-orientated aesthetics be able to reflect on the pitfalls of the practice-orientated philosophy of art? And how does the counterpart of theory formation materialize and become concrete? How do individual things or aesthetic experiences play into philosophical texts as objects of thought? Adorno summarizes the problem as follows. And now there should be an Adorno quote. If the experience of the real, the general, is what is actually mediated, then in art it is the particular. If non-aesthetic cognition in Kant's formulation asks about the possibility of general judgments, then every work of art asks how a particular is at all possible under the rule of the general. This binds aesthetics, as little as its method can be one of subsumption, also subjunction, under the abstract concept, to concept-obeyed concepts whose telos is the particular. His answer, concepts whose telos, so his telos is the particular, is not trivial. However, I would like to ground it in this context for our question by framing it as an exemplary constellation of concept that unfolds its propedeutic effect for philosophy and society by taking the telos of the particular seriously. The individual thing then becomes into view as an invoked object of reference or as the miniature description, but also as a case and as an example in the argumentation yet to be formulated. Baumgarten mentions it in many places in his founding text, the speech that is always necessary for the pedagogue in examples in which those abstract insights are found, as it were, in the concrete. The talk of the case that promises to apply to what is meant, and of the case of game which reports and witnesses to this case, is like a collection of concise reference objects and narratives. It comes as abbreviated in inductions, as one-word references, as miniature narratives of a comparative nature or even highly controversial thought experiments. And Jacques Le Goff defines the term exemplum in his standard work on its medieval roots as follows. An exemplum is un récit bref donné comme véridique et destiné à être inséré dans un discours pour convaincre un auditoire par une leçon salutaire. The unifying function of all the above-mentioned exemplum candidates is to create a level changing within the argumentation for the purpose of the advancements of the argumentation and of the talk itself. So it is by the means of example that we go on in the text that the argumentation is propelled forward. So literally, the German word Beispiel comes from Bispel and means a thing told aside. And it derives from the Anglo-Saxon spell, which in the 13th century was used as a generic term for the word example. It is a short narrative aimed to be instructive, to give an instructive interpretation. Die Brüder Grimm, who are very famous for collecting these German tales, emphasize the casual, the effortless character of such a miniaturized narratio when they understand the example as the narrative that just came along the way. In the long history of its use, the example almost always had a propedeutic character, whereby it can be just be as convincing as the counterexample or as a case study. Le Goff names it a récit efficace, so an efficient kind of narrative, a miniature narrative. And the example always has something to say by showing, by visualizing, by making tangible, something that initially would remain abstract in general. And it therefore has in Kant's eyes no less than the task to demonstrate the reality of our concepts. So this is really what Kant attributes to the example, to demonstrate the reality of our concepts by stimulating the power of imagination, he says imaginatio, and by contributing to their acceptance in a quasi experience of the concept brought about in this way. In his Notizen zur Philologie, also Friedrich Schlegel emphasized at length the invigorating power of the Beispiele. Without, no philosophical essay could have hit the right nerve, as he says. However, he always draws a sharp distinction between philosophy, which does not actually need such aids. But Schlegel is also aware that the example does interfere with the philosophizing itself. So in aesthetics and in the philosophy of art, interestingly enough, the examples, which are themselves entirely textual, also involuntarily as it seems, form the particular object, which means the explicit reference object of the theoretically explicated. The work of the theorist consists in speaking about aesthetic phenomena in their intrinsic concept, but these can only be presented to the readership in the form of fragmentarily abbreviated and exemplarily cut examples. So the question is now whether we end here or whether I'm given a few more minutes to talk about Nelson Goodman and languages of art and what comes then into being by and what is the comment on that by Agamben. But if you want me to finish here, I can also finish here and we discuss it.
Yeah, I'd say it depends on how long it will be. Personally, I'm very interested, so maybe you can have other 10 minutes, I don't know, to maybe um, talk about this. I don't want you to not to finish your presentation, so
Okay.
you can go
I,
on
I
if you want.
tried to skip most of it and do it more orally, and let me have a brief look. So I would like now to talk a little bit about languages of art in Nelson Goodman, which I'm sure you are familiar with. It is called in its subtitle An Approach to a Theory of Symbols. And what is interesting that he introduces there the concept of exemplification right at the beginning of his symbol theory as an operational concept. I'm not interested here in whether this concept works within his theory of art. Since the term is not a genuinely aesthetic or a art-specific one, I would like to find out whether his concept can be tied back to its literal meaning as an exemplary description of the process of exemplification, the particular mechanism of which Goodman accurately describes, even though he is theoretically focusing on something else. Goodman would like to see his talk of exemplification applied to works of arts, whereby the novelty of his thinking, as Simone Marenholtz, for instance, has shown, lies in his insistence of the existence of sensual material properties in the work of arts, which cannot be arbitrarily recorded by labeling them as this or that. Theoretically, Goodman is concerned with showing how work of arts, through or via their material, or even only by metaphorical participation within the material or entities to which they owe their existence, develop a form of referential character that simultaneously separates them from the class of things, from the entities from which they emerged. Interestingly, Goodman's own example of the fundamental mechanisms of exemplification bring to mind not unique work of arts, but reproducible things. However, as we shall see, there is no way that detracts from the phenomenon described or the argument that follows. Rather, it becomes clear that for Goodman, singularity is not a self-imposing ontological quality, but it is a normative attribution, which is why the dividing line between particularity and singularity becomes conceivably fine. In his chapter on exemplification, Goodman first gives a minimal definition of the mechanism in question. In order for something, a thing or an event, to become an example for something else, it must, by a means of an elliptical reduction, as he says, be made suitable as a representative or as an advocate for the other, the targeted set of things. The exemplifying something, later the example, can only do this, however, by making its material, but in a way, disappear. The fact that the original quantity is exhibited in its relationship with a real quantity, however it may be organized, and such becomes a sample, a specimen. For Goodman, exemplification thus presupposes two things as a minimum condition. First, possession plus reference, which means material participation and the formation of a demonstrative reference. For Goodman, the almost imperceivable transformation from an initially merely particular to an exemplary object takes place essentially during and through the sheer act of exhibiting it, its particular relationship of participation. Exemplification refers to that delicate act that simultaneously generates singularity and exemplarity, I'd say, from particularity, which manifests itself in being the part of the original set. So it is really this moment of showing it, accepting it, bringing it about, taking, as he says, cutting it off from its hurt, one could say, and then show it. That's the moment of exemplification. Cut off the relationship and then demonstrate it as if it was still connected. So Goodman is aware that the strengths and the evidence of exemplification, namely the exhibition of material participation that it is in the same move cut, also constitutes its inherent weakness. He diagnoses that even during the act of becoming and giving an example, the literal reference, initially bound by participation, tends to become only a metaphorical participation. He talks of these two directions within an exemplification relationship, and this has to be taken seriously as a reciprocal relationship, as he says. It means that as soon as something has successfully become an example for another, this other can henceforth stand in for the example just as well. Not only does the example, the exemplifier, label the exemplified in a special way, which means distinguishes it as this or that, but the exemplified can also become the exemplifier by denoting, by labeling it. This movement in two directions can therefore be concretized as labeling, distinction, or designation on the one hand, and as denotation, designation on the other hand. At the same time, the concept of labeling prepares this distancing from the material participation that already begins in the act of exemplification. It is meant here by distancing it is that the material participation increasingly loses its focus and becomes more and more opaque. In this double dynamic of Goodman's exemplification of or explanation of exemplification, two movements can be distinguished. Firstly, how something particular generates exemplarity with the aid of arbitrariness, and secondly, how exemplarity generates something singular by singling out and by excluding the particular. So in the act of exemplification, an elliptical pattern is initially obtained from the concrete participation of a thing in a larger quantity through omission and through intensification. It's both omission and intensification. Goodman's example is a tailor's booklet of small watches or small parts of cloth, which is given to a customer to take home. What follows is a selection that prepares the future prosody, denoting the texture and color, but not the wise of the fabric or its price. Certain properties are valued more highly than others, and they are exhibited as such. To stay in the imaginary space of the concrete example of the tailor, a small piece of cloth is cut out of the edge of a random bale of fabric. Only at the moment of material separation from the bale of fabric does the initially still particulate piece becomes something exemplary. And from this moment on, it exemplifies very specific properties of this ball of fabric, precisely those that it still shares with it, in particular the color and the texture. By contrast, the fabric sample remains not only metaphorically, but quite literally cut off from other properties. Goodman leaves no doubt that there is always something arbitrary about this moment of selection in the moment of cutting off the example. The fabric sample does not exemplify the wise of the fabric, which is important to experience. Conversely, it certainly exemplifies smallness, although this is not one of the necessary or desired sample formations it should denotate here. A single example can be an example of many things, even if not of any. is how Gottfried Gabriel summarizes the problem of indeterminacy that derives from Goodman's apt analysis of exemplification. They cut now a big part. I think that I made the point, and finish with chapter 7, Giorgio Agamben's shaping of that, So Agamben says, on the one hand, one treats every example as a real individual case, and on the other hand, one assumes that it loses its validity as something special. And in this exclusion, Giorgio Agamben ultimately recognizes the consistent self-exclusion of the exemplified. The example as an excluding inclusion then becomes, as I quote, elementary solely through its isolation. In this tendency towards the paradox, Agamben says the following, and I quote this longer example. It is obvious about the paradox of the exception, which proves the concreteness of the rule. What the interchangeable example, what exemplarity means for the production of particularity or specialness and singularity as uniqueness, is in analogous way the singular exclusion from the legitimization of the ubiquitous rule. And Agamben concludes in Homo sacer. The example functions as an exclusionary inclusion. Take the case of the grammatical example. The paradox here is that a single statement, which differs in nothing from the other cases of its kind, is isolated from them precisely insofar as it belongs to them. If one utters the syntagma "I love you" as an example of a performative speech act, on the other hand, it cannot be understood as in a normal context. But on the other hand, it must be treated like a real statement in order to function as an example. What the example shows is that it belongs to a class, but precisely therefore, it falls out of it as an exemplary case at the same moment that it exhibits it. In the case of a linguistic syntagma, it shows its own meaning and in this way cancels the meaning. So for Agamben, the given grammatical example is not so coincidental. For him, becoming exemplary is not purely a linguistic event that takes place in the empty space of language. As he says, exemplarity is that which is determined by no other property than that of being named. Not all philosophers, of course, have seen it this way, although there is a remarkable agreement beyond the boundaries of analytic and structuralist philosophy about one point, namely that the example changes in a significant and not always controllable way through the sheer giving of examples. Interestingly, this latent, we could call it the rededication of the particular to the singular in the act of setting an example is set in motion solely through the exhibiting of participation. And all their authority is based on separation, isolation, and exhibition. And the imperceptible transformation that follows concerns here the attention that is focused on the one-sided use of examples as an example for something else. So that is, and then I think I close with the next. Yeah, I will close with that. The example is excluded from the normal case, not because it does not belong, but because of its affiliation. It is indeed paradigma in the etymological sense of the word, that which shows itself beside a class can contain everything except its own paradigma. And I think this might be a good starting point for the discussion, hopefully.
Thank you, Mirjam, for this very deep and thorough presentation. And I think you touched so many aspects and elements that are really at the core of of the problem of singularity and showed us so many other things that we haven't been discussing so much, and now we have occasion to do it. So I will just keep my role as the animator of the session. This is what we can do. We can open now the floor for discussion. Those who are for those of you who are on Zoom, you can just make yourself visible in some way. You can use the raise hand function on Zoom, or you can actually raise your hand if you have your video on, and we will give you the word. Otherwise, if you are on YouTube, you can just write your question for Mirjam, and Greg or I will be able to read it for the whole session. So I guess the discussion is open. Please do not hesitate to raise your hand. Is it okay if I close the presentation, Mirjam, so that I
Yes,
can
of
see
course.
everyone?
Yeah.
So I believe Edward Halper has a question. So please, Edward, thank you. Edward, we cannot hear you. So maybe you. Yeah.
Yes,
Now we hear you.
Now we can hear you. Yeah.
I'm having much for the paper. Apologize, my internet is not working. I only heard maybe what I heard was excellent. I missed what I missed. That the ending is I don't know, a Gambin, like it was a very Hegelian perspective. It's excluded, and that's what I really want, the extent to which it's possible somehow to grasp as an individual in an way, because it excludes itself, and and if we can preserve of the whole, we're in a position, and but that makes it intelligible. The contradiction, it looks like alien resolution grasps the contradiction individual, and is that what a Gambin is? Is that a way of understanding a token of how individual is?
Edward, I hear you very the same as you heard me. So I hear you quite interruptively. So I try to reformulate the question. If I understood you correctly, you are not set. You're saying that Agamben gives a very Hegelian argument here. And I would say yes and no. What is interesting about Hegel, of course, that Hegel has a strong notion of the particular, but a very weak notion of the singular. And what is so interesting about Agamben talking about Nelson Goodman at this place is, of course, that in a way one can reshape Goodman's description of in this tailor's shop as something where something particular but not unique and not singular becomes unique just by the moment of isolation from this cloth where it belongs to. So in a way, I think the Agamben point is here that if he looks on this tailor scene in Goodman, you can see that from the particular, by extempting it from its herd, I say here, it becomes singular. In the moment, it becomes exemplary for something else. So that the singularity itself is something that is produced. And I think that was the point that interested me more here than the paradox of self-exclusion it from the herd where it comes from, where it stems from. because I've never seen another philosopher talking about the becoming singular by making the particular exemplary. And this, I think, is an interesting move and is not often be regarded and not often be thought of.
It becomes, in some sense, been excluded from ability for this.
Edward, can you maybe try to turn off your screen so maybe we can hear you better because we are having a hard time hearing you.
So in excluding the particular becomes part of the whole. Ability of somehow re-including it in its exclusion type move.
Edward, I think we are. Yeah, unfortunately, my suggestion was not doing much good. Sorry,
Okay.
sorry if I suggested that. If I will just try and rephrase the question if I understood it. You are just asked by making the particular a singular and by excluding the singular is reinstated in the totality. Is that what you said?
Yes.
Okay.
It's
So
excluded. The exclusion is the thing that it's excluded from. In excluding it, it belongs, and it's the possibility of a higher state between what's been excluded and that's what this Hegelian type.
Mm-hmm. So Mirjam, I don't know whether it was clear what the argument was, and if you have a response.
Yes, I think I'd come back to it the following way. So back to Hegel. For Hegel, of course, in this dialectical process, there is no way to have a strong notion of the singularity, because in the dialectical project, everything is constantly changing its position and everything becomes interchangeable. So also in this Hegelian style, in his equations he makes in his own text, all the concepts are shifting due to this dialectical process. And therefore, of course, it is not a philosophy in any way having an easy way into thinking the singular as the total uniqueness that will never be exchangeable, that will be never interchanged, that will be never be in a process. So this can only create a type of singularity that is very, I'd say, sterile, which is very, very static. And of course, Agamben comes here from a very different angle, and it's interesting that one can find it itself in the way that a thinker like Goodman, who is not very, who we cannot, he does not come from Hegel in any way, that Agamben gives a description that even if this cloth is very ordinary and nothing in particular, the isolation from its material which it shall denote makes it in a weak sense, in a very weak sense, very empirical sense of the word, singular, or singularizes it, singles it out from the rest of the cloth. And then having, with this moment of becoming separated from the cloth, losing qualities and gaining other qualities, losing lots of qualities, remaining some qualities, and gaining new qualities, and especially this new quality of becoming exemplary of the cloth it derives from. And what's interesting for me that, of course, Agamben would explain this as a self-exclusion, which is too far, too active for Goodman to acknowledge. But he has a very good point that we should maybe don't have such exaggerated concepts of singularity in as which it's an opaque kind of uniqueness we can never access, but more think of it as a strategic leveled way of singularity, like singularity in degrees, maybe. So in a way, we could say that it might be interesting to skip all these notions of singularity or as the pure uniqueness that can never be accessed, and more think of a kind of singularity that is accessible as a tailor's example, as a piece of cloth that loses qualities, gains qualities, and in a way is singled out and gains then the quality of exemplarity, although we are very aware of that it's never a full replacement in the full sense. So something that is singled out can never obtain as a material thing all the qualities it still should denote. And I think that is not so paradoxically, but more gives us the idea of a more accessible way of thinking of singularity, not as something totally eccentric or not talking about black holes, but really talking about something that is becoming different by singling it out and giving it a purpose in a way in order to use it differently. And this difference in usage is interesting for me here.
So if I understand your proposal, you're saying the singular is always the effect of a singularization, so to say. And
One
we
would say
should,
so. If we look into the text of Goodman, we would say yes. It's interestingly enough, the singular is produced, and it is produced by purposeful separation, demonstration. So it's a lots of acts that are used. So the singular is producible by singling it out, sorting it out, cutting it out, by isolating it, by cutting off a certain kind of context, and by exhibiting it, by labeling it, by, as you say in Goodman, by labeling it differently, and then, and then give him the purpose of being an exemplar now. And the exemplar is more than just the particular, as in Hegel. Yeah? And of course,
yes,
as then Agamben says, Agamben is then interested in this chain of exemplars that go and show other exemplars, etc., etc., etc. So Agamben then really makes a chain of exemplars showing to other exemplars, and was interesting that he then goes back to this Greek concept of paradigma, because he says, no, what is a paradigma can never be repeated, but it will create other paradigmata. It will create other kinds of originality. And that's, I think, is also very interesting, that how does the original then comes, or notions of the originality come into play.
yes, thank you. And Edward, I'm sorry if you are having connection problems, but I hope you could hear Miriam's response.
Thank you very much.
Very well. Thank you. Are there any other questions, remarks? I believe Aloysia. Yes, please, Aloysia.
Yes, I have to turn myself on again. I often make the mistake that I talk too much, and my questions are more like trying to build a new theory. But what is fascinating with how you just explained the cutting off and the making singular, and then the distinction to the paradigm interests me because, as some of you know, I'm working on a theory of guessing. And what I'll try to do is I'll try to show how, the sort of thought process that happens when we guess includes, this distinction in a very interesting way. So if we look at how Peirce saw abduction, he saw it as a movement from the singular to the general, but he said that it's not like an induction that the singular is made into a general, but it's actually introducing a new general. This is where you said, Mirjam, the creative comes in. That's also where the paradigm happens in the end. But the process is so interesting because how can this happen? So my question to you, Mirjam, is to help me with my guessing book. So how do I make this point that there is a knowledge that comes from the sensible because of this magic transformation from, a singular into something like a paradigm?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a very good question, Aloysia. How can I answer that briefly? So,
maybe make it easier and just focus on, one of them, because I know I brought all of the parts back
you were
in.
all of the parts, yeah.
Yes, and I'm sorry for that, but so it seems to me that it is, in this performative act that this transformation can only happen. And the problem of philosophy is that we speak of these things as if they were static. I mean, not Hegel, but so
Yes.
the question is the participation in something, after the cutoff, still the same, or is it different? Can then a new generality, no, it's not even so it's not subsumed under a general. It's an individual or a singular that still has the power or function to become a paradigm, something general, but now from the sensible and not through this thought process. I'm sorry, see, I can't do it either.
Yeah, so maybe the answer should be enigmatic. But I would like to give you a very clear and sharp answer. So in a way, the whole Goodman was about to demystify the whole act of cutting off, making no the act of cutting off, sorting out, singling out, labeling it, bringing it into new use. This was all very down to earth, a down to earth argument to get rid of this, highly eccentric notion of singularity. And I write in this book quite often about the abduction in Paris, which is of course also a big thing for Deleuze and his cinema books. And it is also this, very prominent. I think that what I remember about the adoption is that, of course, you ask me, how can we do a good guessing? How can we distinguish the good from the bad guessing? How can we be sure? How can this intuitive sureness of grasping something, how can we become better in good guessing and opposite to the wrong guessing? Is that the question? How can we describe the process that we can tell in the middle of it, whether it'll end up as a good or as a bad guessing? And of course, my answer would be more that also in our wrong guessing, there might be something very creative and intelligent in it. And I'm quite convinced that people also achieve goals by wrong guessing, by not giving a perfect example of hitting into the score, but by failing to hit the score, they can still achieve a lot of things. And this, I think, is due to this creative moment in what happens in this performative process. So I'm tempted to say that you'll find a great variety of performative acts that lead to something that is ultimately very productive, although if it's as guessing itself, it is not successful, or as a good guessing, it's not success.
Thank you. I will come around and ask you the question in a different way later in private. Thank you so much, though. I appreciate your attempt to wrap your mind around it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Aloysia, and thank you, Mirjam, for the response. Are there any other questions? Because if there aren't, maybe I can.
Hi. Oh,
I think Ben has a question.
Oh, Ben, please go on.
sorry. I'm trying to figure out the Zoom. I couldn't see where to raise my hand. Can you see me?
I see you.
Yes.
In the future,
We
We
Ben,
can see you and hear you.
it's under the react button on the bottom of the screen.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
Just so you know.
Okay.
All right.
Thank you. It's not showing up. Yeah, thank you so much, Mirjam, for your talk. Yeah, very good to hear more perspectives on singularity. I just have two questions. One is, and my name is Ben. I'm a graduate student here at the Chinese University, same university as Greg. We were also fortunate enough to have Aloysia visiting us recently. Yeah, so we two questions. One is a follow-up to Ed's question, and the other is maybe more sort of philological, but I'll do the Ed one, Dr. Halper's question first. I just want to paraphrase what I heard in that question, and then you'll see why I'm confused. So it sounded to me sort of like Hegel doesn't get singularity because, right, any particular can be endlessly sort of dialectically reappropriated or recontextualized or negated and redefined. Okay, and so I understand that that would be opposed to some sort of concept of singularity as this irreducible,
Yes.
irrepeatable something, right? But then you said Agamben wants singularity to be sort of always a production. It's got different degrees. It's sort of an example that can function as an example in one context and as a particular in another context. So I'm actually not quite sure. To me, that's not a problem. I might have other problems with Hegel, but maybe the singularity isn't my biggest problem with Hegel, actually. So,
No.
to me, if Agamben is the same as Hegel, that's fine. But I just wasn't sure how that's different. And then my other question is the philological question, maybe more boring, but while you were talking, I had three different meanings of example came to mind. The easiest would be to use the German, the difference between Beispiel and Vorbild. So, of course, in English, an example could both be sort of exemplary or exemplifying something that's valued as something to copy, kind of like maybe in the case of artistic genius, imitation, and then just an example as an explanation, right? An example as something to show. And then the third one actually, I think, is something closer to a symbol or something, which to me is the Schneider, the tailor one, where that's neither a Vorbild in the sense of a moral exemplar, and it's also not a Beispiel in the sense of theoretical, but it's a sort of a sign. It's standing in for another group. So if we have these three...
It's a pattern. It's a muster.
A muster, thank you.
Yes. So muster and pattern, right. That's correct.
Great, yes. So if we have Muster, Vorbild, and Beispiel, then does that change at all does your analysis apply to each one? Those are my two questions. Sorry if that's
I
a lot.
really try to have an analysis for all of them, and I would try how they are interconnected, although of course they have different weight in the argument. That's correct. Yeah. And it's correct that particularly Goodman talks about patterns. In order to explain exemplification, he really talks about material patterns, you know. And yes, I would say that we have in all these discussions we have to different degrees the same problematic structure. And I think for all of these, the same problematic structure is first, how does it come that the example does not only illustrate? So we think it should serve as an example would mean just to illustrate something that is clear and only has to become more concrete for those who are weak in abstract thinking. You know, this is how usually the example comes. But if you start teaching philosophy, you will soon find out that, especially the longer you teach, sometimes the discussion ends with people being all very exhausted, and then they agree on only one final idea. We haven't chosen the right example. Maybe it was our discussion went so utterly wrong, we couldn't come together because we have chosen the wrong example. And but when you really black out the examples out of philosophical texts, you see that they don't serve just illustrative purposes. You see that the argumentation itself is jumping or starts to jump, that there are leaps, blackouts in between. If you cut out the examples, you see that they serve something which the argumentation cannot do in a way, or fails to do. And I would also say, also in teaching, the moment where you are looking for an example is the moment where you see that you lose the audience, that you lose the people listening to you. You see, you lose them because they cannot follow. And then you try to bring them back following your argument by bringing up a silly example. And many times the examples are really, really bad, really, really bad. But in a way, they initiate imagination of the people. They initiate something of what I may call bodily experience in a way, or if at least the imaginative processes have like a more bodily or in your body being ability in a way. And people get a moment of, I think it's also what we call it Selbstwirksamkeit, so that they see that there is something given, like a miniature thought experiment, where they can entertain their thoughts and where you can bring them back to the point where you are. And I was very fascinating in this of how can the example be at the same time bad and helpful? How can it be at the same time misleading and recollecting and coming back to the original argumentation? And I think it has to do that in each of the three cases you meant, we have the problem of how can something particular serve for something else? How can something particular, without denying its own qualities, become exemplary for something else? And it means always that this kind of isolation and exhibiting moment also means that the mixture of qualities which are meant and those who are not to be meant is in a way, in a changing way, as if you had, like, I always describe it as what is quecksilver in English? So it is something you try to grasp, and the moment you try to grasp it, it runs out of your fingers like liquid iron, a little bit like that. And this quecksilver-like moment of it, I think, comes to this paradoxical structure where always these three components of being a role model, being a pattern, and being just a brief explanation in a way cannot be reconciled in 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 the given moment of a dialogue or of a philosophical controversy. And your first question was back to, yes, I may make Agamben here more structuralist as he may be, but I would prefer not to sum him up as a total Hegelian point of view. Of course, it's right, especially, and now it comes back to Neiman, the question of the Holocaust is always this question of, is it unique and can it be repeated? And then, but can it be, if it's unique, we don't have to fear that it will happen again, right? So why are we in constant fear of that it is repeated if we insist at the same time that it's absolutely unique? I'm sorry, I have to open that door because nobody else can do it, and it's my son. I'm back in a minute.
No problem. So Ben, I hope you are satisfied with the question. If there are any other comments or remarks or questions, you can already make yourself visible.
Yeah, that's okay with me.
Perfect, Ben. Thank you.
Alex, there was a question from someone who had to leave, so maybe I can ask it for them.
On YouTube?
No, it was on Zoom, but he had to leave already.
Okay, I didn't receive it. So yeah, please.
Yeah, no questions on YouTube right now. So
Perfect. Yeah. And Aloysia, then I want to know more about your book on guessing. So
Oh, yeah. I just wanted to say that Miriam, I'm sure she's back in a second. She did me a great favor by, basically saying that the example could be bad and thoughtful. So that was her answer to my process of guessing, because what we're doing is we're using something sensible and we are sort of turning it into the way in which we try to find, something knowledgeable, something that will hold or stand up. And so I thought that was very useful to say that it's a role model, a pattern, a brief explanation, like in an example that can do the job. And then you create a new general and you're like, that's it, and that's how I think about guessing. And so my book does a little bit what Mirjam did. It, looks at, some culprits like Baumgarten and also Kant's, critique of judgment, but others too. I see that Mirjam is back. I don't want to steal her.
don't worry, thank you. So I think Greg has a question on behalf of someone who had to leave. So Greg, please.
yeah, thanks. It's just a very general question, and the attender wanted to know about if you have any thoughts on Nancy's book being singular plural, and if you have any thoughts about the exemplary in relation to Nancy's ideas, or if this is a bit outside of your wheel.
No, I read that quite a long time ago, and I think it appeared a little later. It is a very small book, as I recall, and that. But do you have a specific interest? Because Nancy more goes into the question of society, because it's more about our relations. So I think it's more what Reckwitz might have picked up in his book about die Gesellschaft der Singularitäten.
I'm not sure because he didn't share much before he left, but yeah, I mean, in NC he speaks about being with, right? The being with as this kind of essential feature of being.
Yes,
the
so
singular is never actually by itself, actually.
yes. So for Nancy, I'd say it is. I think it is more a notion of how you'd. So all what I was concerned is more about how does in philosophy this strangeness of being singular and exemplary at the same time, although these two things seem to exclude themselves, work together quite well if you look closely, like in Goodman and other authors. And I think for Nancy, it is much more about how is a singular being working, functioning, being at the same time in a world and being connected to all others. So I read him more as maybe he's interesting about how he would describe societies, maybe also Eastern and Western societies, because oh, that's mein Spatz, ich mach dir noch mal auf, wenn du kommst, ja? Das eben war der Postmann, jetzt kommt noch mal der Sohn. So I think it is really more about how do I regard myself being unique and then connect myself to the rest of the world, and how does this work? And I think we should look more into this idea of how do singulars who regard themselves as being singular, how do they work on the streets? How do they work out in society? How they deal with their own needs and the rest of the needs? And of course, we need, I think what is interesting that how do we find a common ground to react, to interact, to form a society, to build a culture? How do we do that? I have to say, I go out for the minute that and I answer the phone, because if I'm sharing this with you, it won't be an answer to your question. So I just close my mic.
Yes,
But I still
thank you.
But I still hear your
Here, we will.
Don't worry, we are here.
May
So
I
Greg,
say,
thank you
may I
for
say something in between. I am very sorry I couldn't ask any question. I was meanwhile in two meetings and two departmental meetings, and I met two students, and my Hegel seminar is in 10 minutes. But then I will ask Mirjam to send me her presentation, and I think.
Jakob, can you please repeat your question?
Yes, I am sorry I couldn't ask you anything, and I heard maybe half of the talk because I was at the two departmental meetings meanwhile, and I had two students. And my Hegel aesthetics class lecture is in 10 minutes, so now I have to.
So you can save Hegel here, because I was not friendly with him. I was not very. I was not giving him much credit of the.
I heard that. And now I have to discuss the symbolic art form with my students in 10 minutes. But please, could you please send me? I send you an email, and could you send me your presentation or the text, and we can discuss it.
I'm so sorry.
Do you read by any chance? Do you read German also?
Yes, of course.
Yeah. Okay. Well, then that's easier. Yeah. Okay. Lovely.
Sorry, Aloysia, you wanted to say something as well.
No, I was just looking forward for Jakob's question because he works on paradigma, but I think we're going to hear a talk by Jakob soon anyway.
Yes, and unfortunately, I mean, the academic word is a complex word, so we perfectly understand, Jakob. Thank you for being here with us, despite all these meetings and everything else. So yeah, I'm sure you have a lot to share. So we look forward to your talk and also to the discussion maybe in other venues. If there are not other questions, are there other questions? If there are not, maybe I can try and say something nice about.
I'm pretty sure you have a question, Alessandro.
I can maybe try and say something nice about Hegel, yes, but
I think he has enough defenders. I think there are enough defenders of Hegel here in the room. We need more.
No, don't worry. No, it's not really about Hegel, but the background actually is that this is it's very welcome to have a little bit of criticism of Hegel, because this seminar has been organized by the two guys for the time being that have written books on Hegel and singularity. So I mean, Hegel is largely represented, and it's not a problem. Aloysia, thank you, and hope to see you soon.
Yeah,
I have a more general concern about Goodman's idea, and maybe a clarification question, so to say. There is, I'm sure you know, Emanuel Aloa's book on images, Das durchscheinende Bild.
Yeah.
And Emanuel has a criticism toward Goodman in his account of exemplarity, because a problem is precisely that, um, so to say, the sample always needs to be labeled, so to
Yes.
say. And in a way, I wonder whether this is a way of saying that, so to say, this is also a way of, so to say, this can be described as an insufficient account of singularity, precisely because you need, so to say, some form of universality, and you need some sort of linguistic compensation in order to make the singular into the singular that it wants to be, so to say. And that is the first. And also, I was wondering how Goodman's account of the sample plays into your idea of singularity, because I mean, if we are looking for a strong singularity, so to say, so if we are looking for a singular that is, so to say, unlike everything else, so to say, the problem of the sample is precisely that anything can be made into a sample, so to say. So any piece of cloth can be made into a sample. And then one last question that, I mean, it all concerns Goodman, but now I'm more thinking about Agamben. I feel that Agamben's reflection is very French, meaning that I feel that he has in mind probably Lacan, and also all the dialectics of totality and particularity, so to say. And hi, Jakub, thank you. Have a good day, girl. And I was wondering, maybe will it be important to distinguish between, so to say, a recurring question throughout the seminar is what is the opposite of singular? And I feel the discussion is very different if you say that the opposite of singular is universal, if you say that the opposite of singular is plural, and if you say that the opposite of singular is the total, so to say.
Yes.
And I feel that maybe, and also the reference to Reckwitz helps.
Yeah.
I mean, it is more, your account is maybe more focused on the opposition between singularity and totality than on the opposition between singularity and universality, because in a way, the singular becomes the exception, the exceptional, so to say, becomes and I'm not, I mean, it's not really, so to say, a problem. I'm just wondering if you agree that it's three very different way of understanding singularity, and what you think of it, and if it plays any role into your account of singularity. But thank you. This was absolutely brilliant. So I'm very happy.
Very, very good question. Because I looked especially into this beginning of founding years of aesthetics. Of course, the opposition is double. The opposition with Hegel would be the particular, or that what Hegel would challenge is the notion of the particular instead of the singular. But in the beginning of the aesthetics, of course, the universal truth is the opponent of this cognitio sensitiva. So against this cognitio sensitiva, that was my point, does not speak that the senses can be cheated, but it is the singularity as such. So part of my reshaping of that initiative, or the starting point of aesthetics as a big subtopic within philosophy, I try to break with the idea that it is just the notion that the senses can be falsed, that the senses can be deceive, that I said, no, the scandal is the singularity of the sensual moment, that it cannot, in a very strong sense, that it cannot be repeated. And how, if it cannot even repeated be for the same person who perceives something as nice or beautiful, how can it then become, in a way, a universal truth? How can we make this happen? And then I found out that the only way to do it is to go a sideway in a way and say, okay, we cannot justify a strong singularity as basis of truth, but we can justify cognitio sensitiva as a role model for cognition as such, for as experience as such, etc. pp. And this happens. This is, I think, the reason why philosophy finally agreed to integrate aesthetics, is that aesthetic as such, or the artwork as such, became a role model in itself, became a sample of, became in a way exemplary to describe how experience and cognition may work. And this was the eingehegte way, so that was the allowed way it could path its way. But it's absolutely clear that the two challenging opposites I have here in mind, that I do not seek a very strong notion of singularity. I think it is much more interesting to look into, like we now talk about strategic atom weapons, that I more look into more strategic, singular, or in a way, in a leveled way, yeah, talking about of levels of singularity. And I would totally agree to all the criticism of the pattern example in Goodman as Emmanuel Aloa does it. But the labeling is interesting in so far as you said, as the deficiency of it, the label has to compensate all the things it cannot exemplify. The label has to say, this is its name, this is its price, this is the wise of the cloth. So the labeling has the wording has to do whatever the example cannot show itself. But in examples in philosophical texts, of course, it is so interesting that the philosophers do not label their examples. Of course, they place them in the text in order to illustrate something. But interestingly enough, they usually do not label their examples. They think the examples do their work without labeling. And that makes them, of course, more direct and more appealing directly to the imagination. And this is exactly what is, I think, happening, that other faculties than just reasoning are brought into the arena of thought in order to go forward if the rest of the audience is stuck or lost by too abstract thinking, of people not being capable following the abstract sampling. Then, of course, you go into the example. And that, I think, is also differently why examples and texts are not labeled samples as in the Taylor's example, but that, interestingly enough, it is the reader or the listener who has to do the labeling. And especially because the labeling is left to the reader, is left to the listener, this is the moment of engagement that brings him back, into attention, that brings him back to the train of thought, that you force him to do the labeling himself. And every distant reader has to do the labeling of the example, has to see what is exactly the purpose of this example here, and does it serve its course? And interestingly enough, it is precisely the act of labeling that has to be individualized by the readers or the listeners all across the centuries. And this is the moment where thinking of one own is stimulated, and people are, thinking then around the problem the philosopher is having here. And I think you can trace all the philosophical problems of argumentation by singling out the examples. And this, I think there are projects who do that. I mean, years after I did that, I think it's also from the literary scholars in Dortmund and in other places really try to build a data structure and singling out all the examples philosophers give on different occasions. And it is really, it is a Schlachtfeld. You look into a battlefield of unsolved problems of philosophical argumentation. So they are at the same time outposts of philosophical argumentation and the points of their greatest defeats, you know. And
yeah,
and this is very, very interesting because the whole conflict of this quasi-universally of becoming exemplary shapes a very particular form of, you may call them a weak form of singularity, but it's still a very, very interesting form of singularity, and it occurs to us philosophers in many, many cases, and it is a real practical and theoretical problem.
I absolutely agree. This is very exciting. And also, I mean, in Italy, we have, of course, not only Agamben, and also Carlo Ginzburg, who's been working a lot on this. And there is also a colleague of mine, Antonio Lucci, who is an enthusiast reader of your book, who's actually working on these problems, namely, what is a case study in the human sciences? What is a paradigm? What is singular, so to say, methodologically? So again, this is a very exciting point, and I think this is also a very good closing point for our discussion. And Mirjam, thank you so much for your generous presentation and for this beautiful exchange. We remind you all that the next meeting of this seminar series will be tomorrow, actually, with Pauline Sabrier, who's going to talk to us about Plato's Sophist. So we'll be going back to the Greeks, so to say, so that we can actually verify if they, as Mirjam said.
And Alessandro, many, many thanks. And I can send you, of course, the copy of if I haven't done that before, but I can send you the copy of the book, which is not translated, but in German for all those who read in German.
Yes,
and you can share it under the people who
That'd be incredibly generous. Thank you, Mirjam. And also, we, as we said, to all the others, we are going to edit a collective volume from this seminar. So we will write to you regarding a possible book chapter if you're interested. But there will be time for this. So again, Mirjam, thank you.
Thanks for listening so long.
Thanks for coming.
This was very good. And so, Greg, good night. And to all of you, good day.
Have a great day.
Thank you for being here. And we see each other tomorrow. Thanks again.
Yeah.
Goodbye.
That was lovely.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.